Yeah, so I think the goal here was just one of our standard quarterly meetings, but typically pairing those up with a technology kind of topic to just chat about. And I think we've sometimes talked about whether we want to split those two things apart, like have separate meetings for the two, just to have more checkpoints along the way. But today we'll have Buddy chat a little bit about some technology areas of interest that he has from pre-Nevo days, and I'm going to take it away in a moment, and then we'll kind of conclude this afternoon with just a general update on Nevo from a Q3 2022 perspective. So go ahead, Buddy. All yours.
Excellent. Well, guys, thanks for your time and attention. This is a bit of a passion subject for me. So at any point, if you have questions or want to interrupt me, please do so. I'm totally fine with that. Pretty informal conversation. The subject today is app designer platforms, how I built one and what I learned from the process. Let's see here. Yeah, okay, terms. I think this is a helpful first place to start. You've probably heard of low-code platforms and no-code platforms. To me, those are subcategories of a type of system where the primary interface is a designer rather than code. So, at Nevo, we all program in our IDEs and our editors. These low-code, no-code platforms, the primary interface isn't code, it's some kind of UI visible designer. The term is, the low-code and no-code terms are helpful when comparing the types of products within that category, but it's not helpful of comparing them with products outside of that category. So I prefer the term app designer because to me, it's easier to compare it with like traditional ways of creating applications. So I'll be using that through the rest of this talk. But you can kind of in the back of your mind associate it with low code, no code type platforms. Make sense?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, so my goals for this, I want to talk about the benefits and use cases for app designers. I think it's a great way to stay current with what's happening in our industry. There may be potential future Nevo projects where we use some kind of app designer platform. They're exceptional for like side projects, and they're a lot of fun to build. And then I want to share how I approach building one and the lessons I learned along the way. So pretty straightforward. There are some good reasons to not like app designers. For example, you can become locked in to like a cloud or a specific company. A good example of this is my partner Casey owns a marketing firm, and for some of our clients, she uses Wix, which is a designer for building websites. But she's locked into that platform, right? So if her customers want to go somewhere else, they really can't take what they make with them. They oftentimes have limited functionality. You know how to do something because you're a programmer, but in this particular platform, you can't because they don't provide a tool or a mechanism for doing that. They're black boxes oftentimes. So when something goes wrong, like how do you fix it? It just feels like a big magical box, and you have very little control over what's happening. And the tooling can be clunky and confusing. They have their own sort of mental models around how they want you to build apps, and translating that between what can be a bit of a frustrating process. And these are all good reasons to not like these platforms. Why might you care about app designers? From my perspective is that and this is kind of an interesting one, it's a higher level of abstraction. So we typically work with code directly. And when I was going over this presentation with Pete earlier, he was talking about how we don't write in binary or assembly code anymore. We continue to go higher levels up. Well, app designing platforms are essentially another step up the chain of abstraction. And because of that, you can oftentimes deliver projects much more quickly. Depending on the platform, they can become exportable so that you're not actually locked into these things. It's a growing industry. I read over the weekend that something like by 2024, it's predicted that app designing platforms will account for like over 60% of applications. So it's definitely gaining tons of traction. I find that you can create, really polished products in these tools. And then oh, sorry, I thought I saw a hand up. And then lastly, there can be some really interesting fiscal advantages. An example of that would be, a client comes to you, they want some kind of application or feature, and you build it in one of these tools, but you turn it around really quickly for a lower fee, you might get return business. So maybe if you were to do it manually, you might say charge $50,000, but if you did it in this app platform, you might charge 30, but get 2 projects, end up making 60. So in the end, you end up getting more money. It's like a contrived example, but there are really interesting ways to think about how you charge and bill for work done in some kind of app designing platform. Why do I personally care about app platforms? The main reason I care is because of the faster iteration allows me to have higher quality ideas. So it's oftentimes in the past when I've done consulting, someone will say, like an executive would say, hey, could you build me this particular thing? I'll go off and build it. But it's really just like the first or second sort of version idea that I have. But with an app platform, I can iterate on ideas much quicker, which allows me to give them the 5th, 6th, 7th generation idea, right? With a lot of feedback back and forth. And you can really begin to mold and shape the app, and you don't feel like you're kind of stuck with one specific version of it. So yeah, and this was, something I realized over years of building different apps. I just felt frustrated with how slow it was to go from concept all the way to like production. It just felt like it took so long. And I watched a talk by this, this is my personal favorite video talk I've ever seen out of probably the thousands I've watched over the years, by Brett Victor. And there's a link in here. I can share the slide deck with all of you after if you want to go watch the talk. But he basically says that creators need an immediate connection with their creations. And this is similar to as a kid when you learn to draw or write. If you have a pen or a pencil and you make movements, you can immediately see and get feedback on what you're creating. And that feedback allows you to refine and change the way you approach things and get better and better and better. And I felt like with creating apps, the feedback loop is oftentimes much larger than you would like it to be. Ideas are constantly going through your mind, but the time to actually make them happen, you sort of get stuck with an idea. And so that's where, for me personally, I really found app designing platforms to be interesting. So about 5 years ago, I was consulting and I had this idea and I decided that I would build an app designer platform. So I'm going to now cover how I did that. So just at a high level, the component parts of this platform is I started with a data structure. This is literally the steps I took. It's not like a contrived order. This is actually how I went about it. So I started with a data structure. I built a compiler for this data structure. I created a little mini JavaScript framework for it, and then an editor. And then I'll show all that in a demo at the end. But sort of the end result of that was some of the most approachable, well-organized, and creative code that I've personally written in my career. And I felt really proud of this project. It's really nice in your career to have things that you look back on and you say, I did really good work there. And this was that project for me.
But
okay.
Maybe you'll touch on this back on the previous slide. I was just curious, maybe you'll, between number 2 and number 3, I was just kind of curious which I would have imagined coming first. And maybe you'll touch on that a little bit, but I could have almost imagined that you almost need the JavaScript framework in place before you figure out what the compiler should generate. Or maybe the JavaScript framework truly sits on top of whatever the compiler kicked out. But just a
yeah, it does sit on top. it's a good distinction to make. The data structure and the compiler were abstract enough concept. They were dealing, you can think of them as dealing with almost like metal. I mean, it wasn't like, it's not true computer metal, but like the base the base structure of an application. And so I could have had no JavaScript framework. I could have done it a million different ways, and it would not have impacted the data structure or the compiler. They were generic enough to not care.
Nice.
And I'll give some examples of that later, where we actually walk through the data structure and kind of look at what it's doing. So does that help, Pete?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's what that JavaScript framework really is. Probably will answer my question a bit more too, but yeah, I think that definitely helps.
Cool. Okay, so the data structure. So I built a custom data structure, which is a doubly linked list supporting a tree layout. And it was inspired by a data structures course I took on Udemy years ago. And there's an example of what this data structure, let me pull it up real quick so you can see it. So this is like a very basic implementation of that data structure. And what you'll see is that it has a root ID, which represents the first node in the trunk of this tree. And then it has a next ID, which is when you add a new node, what should the next ID be? And then it has a list of nodes, right? And this is in an object, not an array. And that's so that you can get hash time lookups for your nodes. And it's completely flat in terms of what it looks like in this JSON representation, but it represents a tree structure. So if you look at, there's five important attributes here. There's ID, there's parent, there's child, there's next, and there's previous. And having all four of those pieces of data allow you to go in any direction you'd like to go. So if you're at, say, a child element and you want to go back to the parent, you can quickly do that. If you're a sibling and you want to go to the next guy that's next to you or the one that's previous to you, you can do that as well. So it allows you have all the data needed to traverse in any sort of direction you'd like to traverse in. This also means it has some interesting properties, so that if I wanted to move a whole subtree from one place to another place, I'm just updating a couple of we'll call them pointers, but they're essentially IDs. So you can see, for example, that the first node has a child of 2, right? So this would be like trunk, and then it would have a child of this. If I wanted to, let's keep going actually. And then this has next to it as a sibling, the 3 node, and then this one has the previous of 2. It doesn't have any children and it doesn't have a next. So it's the end of that sort of level. 4 belongs to 2. If I wanted to move 4 to belong to 1, it's a really simple operation to update these pointers to change the way the structure looks. And if you know, well, you guys all know this, but in JSON, when you nest things in a tree-like structure, it can be really challenging to move them around in memory, right? Because you essentially have to do recursion or some kind of looping through to get the references and then delete them from that place and then put them somewhere else. And then when you want to serialize. So this data structure for me solved a lot of problems with working with JSON and JavaScript. So real brief glance at this, but this is the basic structure for how the platform I'm going to show you what it runs off of at a data structure level. So yeah, the primary benefits of that data structure is, like I said, constant time referencing and the ability to move subtrees any way you like. And you'll see why this is important later when I show the platform. As I do operations like that, it's all really trivial because of this data structure. And then I've already went over the core, the core attributes. Yeah, the other thing to note with this data structure is a library called JavaScript Tree. What this does is it's an API for working with that data structure, which is just essentially a bunch of convenience methods that do common mutations and traversals on this data structure. Once again, if you get super interested, this will all be available for you to dive into. All right, so that was part one of data structures. The second part was, so that's sort of like the base organization of the data structure, but next I needed a way to describe applications on the whole. And so here I came up with a schema that represents a generic application, specifically a web application. And so let me show an example, but basically they cover the standard parts of what an application are: markup, CSS, JavaScript, and then any like modules that you want to use on the internet. Let me show a quick example of that. So this is a sample project called ghost.json. I'll show you this later. And you can see here some of that structure you saw before, but then it has additional attributes in here. And so we have like external JavaScript files that are being used. These can be relative paths or on the web. Same for CSS. What kind of JavaScript or NPM packages are being used in this specific project? What global JavaScript functions exist? CSS variables, CSS, what to do on page load. And then this should look familiar. This is that data structure that we already reviewed before. And you can see if we scroll down a little bit, we have these things right here, these next, previous, and child's parent. But we also have all these decorated, these other attributes that are specific to the platform that I built. But these specific attributes could have taken on any shape. It's just the shape that I chose for this specific platform. And so once I had a core data structure and then a schema for what an application is, I was able to build a compiler from that. This compiler was really simple. It basically understood the data structure, was able to produce standard web files, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then produce framework compatible JavaScript, like in this case, React code, and then write all these files out to disk, right? So the end result of the compilation step was a fully finished single page app. Yeah, the first compiler took me a couple of days to write, and this was really fun for me because the thinking harder about the data structure made all the other programming much easier to contend with. So I found that actually programming the system was like the easiest part in a lot of cases. So once I had a compiler, I created a little mini JavaScript framework that sat on, well, it didn't sit on top, it was injected into. So let me take a step back. So one of the things that happens is when you take your schema, your data structure for representing an application, and you give it to the compiler, you tell it how you want it to be compiled. And so in this case, we inject a little JavaScript framework for the React compile type. And it came with some stuff that you'll be really familiar with: namespace organization, rendering, how to render the app, state management, how to do mutations. It favored a stateless mutation pattern. And this was 5 years ago, so this was like bleeding edge at the time for front-end frameworks. And what to do on app load, and then the JavaScript tree helper libraries. So now I have a schema to represent an application. I have a compiler that knows how to build them. Next, I need some kind of way to configure and manage this data structure. And that's what an editor was. It essentially just knew how to navigate between websites and pages, presented a UI for modifying the underlying data structure. UI components that sort of replace like what you would ordinarily do in code. So like a CSS panel for like changing, sort of like how the Chrome tools works when you go and modify CSS manually. It kind of gives you a nice little interface for doing that. And then a constant preview of the real application. And this was actually a defining characteristic of this platform, because you weren't building like a preview of your app. You were always designing the real app in real time. So everything you did always generated the full app that was ready to be used, deployable at any time. So there, I guess the point to say that is there wasn't a long compilation step to get a working app at the end. It was always happening. This was sort of my first lesson learned in this project. Was I wanted to eat my own dog food. And so I coded the first version of the editor in the data structure itself. So this was an extremely tedious task of trying to program in a data structure, right? So I was trying to build a UI inside of a data structure, right? So it was like doubly hard. I do regret doing it that way initially. I got a lot of wows early on in the project for doing it that way, which I'll show you guys in a minute. But I would have saved myself a lot of heartache and time had I just built a traditional, say, React or Angular editor for the first pass. Once you get through the first pass, you can go back and use the editor that was hand-coded to create one that's not hand-coded. But yeah, I definitely regret doing it, the programming a data structure the first time around. Okay.
You just authored that as JSON, basically?
Yeah. It was extremely tedious task.
You could have authored just a bare minimum in JSON and then bootstrap the editor, then you could self-edit itself and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yep, that's what I should have done. But I was too intrigued by this idea of the platform building the platform. I just got caught up on it. So yeah, 5 years ago, the early feedback I got was developers didn't want it because they would rather code, but they were impressed by how it was bootstrapped. The toughest audience to show this platform to was developers. So at the time, at least, the agencies I showed it to, they were absolutely in love with it and wanted to buy and use it immediately. At the time, I told them, no, it was too early. I wasn't ready to support, real production applications yet because I was still building the platform, but they were, ecstatic about it. And then for designers, it was just, it was too technical. It was somewhere between programming and designing, but it wasn't enough on the designing side for them to feel comfortable to use it. I had plans to address all this feedback. I mean, this had happened in the span of like 3 months, 6 months time. So everything was moving really quickly. But I ended up getting into a business control dispute with my investing partner. And this was a regret I have as well, a lesson learned. I really wish that I'd have been far less worried about control. I essentially committed the crime that a lot of creators make, which is it was my baby, and I didn't want anyone to taint the sort of purity of what I was trying to do. And my investing partner just had ideas about, what it needed, how he wanted to sell it that I just really was not on board with. So that's the lesson I learned there. Any questions before I jump into the demo?
So dive in, go for it.
Cool. All right. Okay, so I just have this running on my local machine. You can get to this project on my public repo. It's open. You can look at all the code. It's all available. I'll publish this in our general channel for your interest. And yeah, so there's a getting started here in the README. It's really straightforward. All the instructions should work for you. And I just have it running locally right here. It's written in Node, and the front end is in React. That's the tech stack here. This is a landing page. We can skip this for now. It's just a landing page. So now we're actually truly entering into the app designing platform is called Bliss UI. Another lesson I learned is my partner, Casey, when I pitched the name to her initially, she said that she did not like the name and very much wanted to change it. And I definitely should have listened to my marketing partner, who this is what she does for a living. But I don't know, in my mind, I just knew that this was the right name, and hindsight is 2020. Okay, so the first view you come to is just a websites view. Originally, I called this workspaces, but I became sort of intrigued by the idea of websites, the ability to create multiple kinds of websites, and the ability to create pages within those websites, because it felt very natural for people to understand what a website is and what pages are within that website. These were originally called projects, and I renamed them to be called pages. So you had websites and you had pages. I'm going to show you a dogs app that I made over the weekend. And by not much time went into this, a very small amount of time. When you choose the website you want to enter, you can then decide what page you want to edit. So I'm just going to edit the index page. Okay, so just a quick preview of the app as a whole. On the left-hand side, you have the HTML. And this was important to preserve the ideas of the web within this app designer platform, because I didn't want to build a kind of abstraction that felt completely foreign to what the web has traditionally meant. I was fine if in later iterations it did that, but initially I wanted it to feel like you had complete control over the app that you were building, because I too was frustrated with, I didn't want a platform where I felt like I couldn't build what I wanted to build. I wanted fine-grained control. So on the left, you have the first div, which this is essentially DOM, right? You have a div, an H1, an H3, another div, a div inside of that, other divs, an anchor tag, an H3. So this is a DOM, and it's organized in a way that the DOM would be organized. And so as I click, I have this properties pane over here on the left, and it allows me to configure the properties for every node in this DOM. So for example, the H1, it has the text dog breeds. If I change this to, dog freeds, you see that this in the middle changed, right? So this is the actual visual representation of what you're building on these side panes. And so, that's how long it took for the platform to recognize the change and update the entire application. And so what this app does, and this is a fully functioning app in the middle here. It's not like a preview. It's not, it'll end up being something else in the end. This is the actual product. So this is just a real simple web page that allows you to explore different kind of dog breeds. It pulls data from a public API on the web to get all the different kind of dog breeds there are. I have an Aussie Doodle, and so we can go and look at Australian breeds, and it just shows a bunch of pictures of what these dogs look like. That's a pretty cute dog. And so the thing I'm wanting you to take away from this moment is you have DOM and you have properties, and then you have a working app in the middle. Those are the three main parts. With the app itself, you can go and say, I have global JavaScript that functions that I want to put into my app. For example, I have this capitalize method here that essentially just takes some value and capitalizes it. where when I go back to the designer, I can go and look at, let's see here, dog breed. Yeah, there's a text function for this anchor tag that grabs that runs a function called name. Well, every DOM element has its own JavaScript associated with it. So I can go and look at the name function here, and it says, hey, go look at the scope and grab the particular dog breed that I'm currently iterating through. I should have stepped back and showed you that this was in a for loop. It's essentially a repeating function here. So that way you can repeat the same DOM multiple times, just like you would in code. And inside of the JavaScript for this guy, he just returns the breeds. Well, that turns into a scope that then can be used here to grab out the name. And then I call that global JavaScript function to capitalize it. Well, where's this data coming from? By the way, if I'm going too fast, let me know and I'll stop and slow down. There's this platform, there's a lot to it, and I'm just trying to get through as much as I can to provoke conversations and questions. There's this thing called a data editor, which allows you to essentially specify a path for data. It's sort of modeled after NoSQL stores in that you have a path and then you have actions on that path. So there's an init action for dogs where we specify some starting point data. We then have these HTTP methods that go off and fetch data from the web. When they're done, and this is a pure function. And so because of that, we just return the original data here. We don't do any mutations. But then when we get the data back, we dispatch and say, hey, go to the path dogs, store the breeds that I get from this data source. So we go look at store breeds. All we do is we get data coming in, we create a new copy of it, we put breeds in there, and then we return that data from this function. And the framework knows how to do all the mutations. So this is where the data lives. There's also a UI data, which basically says, like, am I showing breeds and what is the current selected breed? So that's why when we're in the app, this guy right here, selected breed container, has a function says should show. The should show function says, hey, if this is not true, meaning I want to show all the breeds, then we want to show a specific breed like that. And then the anchor tag for selecting that breed right here on click says handle click. We look at handle click. He dispatches a UI data path that says, hey, set the current breed to the one that was just clicked. Okay, so this is a simple app for seeing dog breeds. Let's show something a little bit different. This is a simple to-do app. I think it's this one. Yeah, here we go. So this is a simple to-do app. You can see all the DOM here. I can type like buy milk. Now, the interesting thing here is that I'm building a new app every single time I make any change, right? It's a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it gets the point across. One of the things I wanted to do is that when you're making state changes, I didn't want to lose that state between page refresh. So I built this ability to, I'm just going to clone all of this DOM right here. Now, the cool thing with cloning is that it actually copies all the CSS, all the JavaScript, all the markup, all the business rules, everything with it. And so now it's rebuilt the whole app, saved the state, injected it back into the app. And so now we have two instances of this to-do app. So if I type in, give presentation, you'll see that the state is being persisted across both of these. This ability to change an app, like for example, if I wanted to, I don't know, move buttons around, I can move buttons, it changes the layout. So now my add to do is above rather than below. Yeah. So this is me just messing with, and you'll see the state is persisted. And that's sort of the point of this demonstration, is just to show how it manages state as you modify the app in significant ways. Lastly, I should show you, so the Bliss website is written in this. I should show you the actual Bliss application. So that's the editor that we're using here. The editor was built in that same data structure. So this is a bit more of a complicated DOM. But it allowed me to edit Bliss from within inside of Bliss, essentially. So this is the running app that you've seen me use before. It should look very similar to this page because they are the same. The other thing that I'll show you is if we look at, let me go back to this guy. It's our simple to do app. I can publish this, and then down here you see, okay, it was deployed, and then I can launch it. And so using the platform was like that. You would just modify the app, how you kind of molded it the way you wanted it, do your work, and then you publish it, and then it was working. You can also export it, so you can download it and get a handy zip file of the full application. And so all the HTML files, all the assets that were used, all the CSS, any components that were needed, any JavaScript that was produced, as well as the original JSON that defined the project from the Bliss UI data structure perspective. So you weren't locked into the platform, is the point I'm making here. You could actually create apps, export them, and put them into any existing application that you had. Also, some other nice features. You know, you had different kinds of views. You can look at it. You could collapse and expand. You know, all basic stuff. What things I have not showed you? It supported page layouts, so you could actually create templates that would, you know, you could inherit from other pages. It supported obviously what you wanted the web page to be called. NPM packages, so you could add any like library that you wanted to use, and the system just knew how to fetch those packages and bring them in and compile them with your project. You could do CSS variables that you use throughout your whole site, which I have this handy dandy little thing up here to help you do that. There was a lot of convenience pieces built into this too. So like you could just say $ID and the system would automatically just give it a unique ID for you. And then you could reference a $ID anywhere, so that you didn't have to worry about like, what is the actual ID. You could do, you know, global CSS where you could just put in selectors and fill out stuff that would trickle down. You could, let's see. That's not that one, not that one. I'm trying to remember. That's that one. It must be in settings. No. Oh, it must be page load maybe. Ah, here we go. Yeah, so this is just what functions to call when the app instantiates, what style sheets you may want to use from the internet or some CDN or even locally from the NPM modules that you were using. So yeah, I think that does a good job of kind of giving a rough overview of what Bliss UI was, the kind of platform it was, and as it relates to designing an app platform. I do have the code open here, so if you're curious about any specific piece of this, we can dive into the code and I can show you how it works. Let's see. Yeah, thank you. All right, it's a good time for questions, comments, concerns, intrigue.
That's pretty nice.
So curiosity is, you're saying that when you make changes, it fully rebuilds the whole application and live updates. Did you, where on your roadmap was doing incremental compilations, or are you doing an incremental compilation? Or is it just kind of wipe everything and regenerate everything?
Sorry, when I say full app, I mean only that specific page.
Okay.
So it doesn't build everything within its website, just that specific page.
Got it. So you could, in theory, try to do incremental compilation within a page, but probably just not worth it, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it's not worth it. And I had gotten to a point where I had come to believe that SPA applications had grown too large. As a general rule, we were trying to do way too much in one single page app, which is where I started to think of like page views as transitions within an application. And I'd seen some really clever work that people have done to make going from one web page to another web page feel like a single page app, but was in fact a different page. And so I was modeling this app after that.
Cool. Are they sharing state, because the data kind of subsystem spans the website, so spans pages?
It does not. It only lives on that page.
Okay.
So the persistence model was up to you to decide how you wanted to implement that, right? We all know that there's different kinds of persistence we want for different kinds of data. So for example, sometimes it's okay to store settings in, say, local storage. Other times you want that persisted, in some like storage layer. Originally, this platform had been tailored to work with, and by tailored, I just mean that it was easy to integrate with like Firebase, for example, right? So you could pull in a JavaScript, like a CDN JavaScript from Firebase, and suddenly you had authentication, authorization, data storage, the whole bit was just completely there. And you had to do very, very little to make that happen.
Cool.
So,
Buddy, this is John Lewicki. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the connection between the data structure you first mentioned and what we're seeing on screen here. Is like the tree structure basically that in your data model, the DOM tree structure, or is it something else?
Yeah, it's the DOM. Yeah,
Okay.
on the left here, this is the tree structure.
Got it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so in fact, if we were to pull this open, I think I just had it. Let's take a peek at that zip file that we downloaded. And I can show you exactly what I mean. Let's see. Yep, okay. So this is the JSON that represents this app right here. So if we scroll down, so these are all like additional attributes that the data structure just doesn't even look at, right? It doesn't care about them. The compiler cares about them, but not the data structure itself. I mean, obviously data structures don't care about anything. They're just data. But yeah, so here is where we pick up on that flat structure. If we scroll through this, we'll see that, 7, 8, they're all on the same level, and that's because it's flat, although it's representing that tree structure. So the first, let's see, if we scroll up, we can see that the root ID is 1. So we know we're going to start at 1. If we look at 1, it's got a name of to do 2. So if we look in here, here it is, to do 2. That's the name of it, right? The type of the element is div. This is just metadata. It's not important to the data structure. But what's next is child 10, right? So if we go look for child 10 in here, I could search for it, but it's more fun to scroll through a lot of JSON. Here it is. It's called container. So if we look over here, there it is, container 10, right? And we just keep doing that until we end up rendering the full tree.
Okay.
Yep. And
So
then
the,
within
so the smarts that know about the sort of HTML or web aspects of these nodes, is that built into the compiler?
it is, absolutely. Yeah, so inside of the source server, we have Am I looking in the right place? No, compiler. So the compiler has it's called core. Core understands CSS, it understands HTML, and it understands JavaScript, and it understands the tree, right? So this is the real basic core compiler, and its only job is to take that JSON data structure and turn it into real HTML, real CSS, and real JavaScript. That's all its job is. The React compiler, its job is to take the DOM and generate React code that can be used within the React framework to generate a React application, right? So that is why in to-do.json, we see that the compiler type is React. So base layer 1, generate all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Base layer 2, generate the React specific code. So if we look, we can see what that looks like. Let's see, do we have any example of that? Right, so this would be an example of JavaScript that works with, let me get down to the DOM so you can see what that looks like. Yes. So this is what it looks like when it's generating DOM via React.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I think it ends right there, actually. It's not a whole
Is
lot of
there-
DOM.
Did you consider, and I personally actually haven't worked in React, but did you consider a way of generating a template as opposed to doing explicit React create component stuff, or does React always do create component regardless? I don't know if that question even made sense.
Yeah, can you try and phrase it a different way, Pete?
I mean, I guess maybe this is just an artifact of the best practice for doing React UI tier, but more of my experience is frameworks that actually pull out of the code and actually have more of a template language. And
Yeah.
build up the UI as well. And so I didn't know whether you had choices of you could have done a more template generation versus a programmatic construction.
Yeah, so so let's take React as a good example. React uses JSX as its template language, right? Which is essentially you're writing XML inside of JavaScript. It then has to go through a compilation step to take that XML and transform it into something that the browser can understand. So this skips that step. So there's no separate compilation needed because of JSX.
I thought JSX actually got transpiled into create element statements, or does it go straight?
It does. Well, so there's actually, so this guy right here, there's actually a method called H, I think it's called, if memory serves, that JSX compiles into. So I think there's shorthand notation. So it doesn't actually like.
Oh, so it
Yeah.
skips those.
Yeah. But essentially this is what's being used under the hood of React. Yeah. Yeah, and the goal wasn't, to say it another way, to answer your question indirectly, Pete, the goal was never to produce code that someone would look at. The whole point was that you didn't have to do that anymore.
Yes, it didn't
Unless
need to be
something
well
goes wrong.
organized, dry, any of those things, because the UI is the central source of authority.
Right, if everything works great, who cares what this looks like, as long as it's efficient and works.
It's just like an executable, right? When you have your source files and you build something that's executable, you don't go and read the executable.
Right.
Yeah, you go and you read the source code. So it's the same with this type of platform.
Yeah, I think my question is more from an ease, from your perspective from authoring it, like whether it would have been easier to generate a template versus generate code like this, but it's probably 6 of one, half dozen another.
No, it's actually way easier to generate code like this.
Yeah.
For sure.
I think it's
Because-
still a reasonable question though, in a way, because for my money, like the holy grail of a low code environment would be one where you could easily bootstrap a viable web application that could then be kind of busted out of the framework and act as the starting point for another application. You mentioned that as one of the kind of use cases that might start with this. If step one is refactor the world, then, because the code structure itself just doesn't adhere to kind of best coding practices, then it does have, some benefit to being, kind of well organized and kind of dry, central, good coding practices, right?
Absolutely. There's no limiting factor in the system to prevent that at all. So you could easily, it might take you, say, 40% more time to create a compiler that produced code that was really nice to look at. But it's not a significant, I mean, we're talking days, not months, right? Maybe a week to do something like that. It's very trivial in the grand scheme of things to do that. And I definitely considered that. The problem was for me was that this platform is most attractive to people who are constantly doing new work. And so if you're an agency or a marketing company or an employee at somewhere where you want a product that just simply doesn't exist, you want to use a tool like this to go and quickly make it. And you may make it 10 times over, right? You may change it 1,000 different ways. And so whenever you eject into code land as a starting place, it is a use case. I just didn't think it was the most significant use case. Does that seem fair, John? I'm not sure if it does.
I mean, I think you're never going to build something that satisfies everybody. The question is whether or not you can build something that, fills a concrete role out there. It seems to me like some of the place where you ended was designers gave you feedback that it was more technical than they were interested in and programmers said, kind of gave you different reasons for not necessarily seeing that as the first tool out of the box. So, you have to come to some kind of middle ground that attracts one or both. And, I think there's a use case out there that says, well, this thing's great for rapid prototyping, but and a good means of bootstrapping your project, if you could figure out the kind of synergy between moving from a bootstrap project to something that can be productionized, that developers would really see as, yes, you took a lot of the heavy lifting out of our hands. Think about it like this, developers love Zeppelin, even though it's doing part of their job for them, right? You take a sketch UI, you publish it to Zeppelin, and there's all sorts of shit you can copy and paste out of there to save yourself the headache of figuring out exactly what styles you wanted or that kind of thing. So if it had that middle ground of, yep, it was great for the designers, they expressed their idea, and now if you could offer more than Zeppelin in terms of like, yeah, you're just screen scraping some styles out of there, but instead you're, actually developed a prototype React application that can then be extended, then I think you have something that can be used for more than, developing the equivalent of kind of Squarespace, right? For developing more than just marketing sites, you can now build applications on it.
And then the challenge of whether you could then iterate on that, whether now once
Yep.
you've changed your ejected code,
Right.
something back to the original design. And
But even if you just solve the first problem of, I'm the best freaking rapid prototyping tool on the planet that gets designers to the point where they can deliver to a customer something that is a clickable version of, a sketch diagram that then, gets bootstrapped into code that other engineers would be willing to work with. I think it's a really interesting middle ground that doesn't necessarily have to solve the hardest problems of being able to actually link into arbitrary APIs and, things of that nature. I almost wonder if like a really good sketch plugin might be the best middle ground around that, because Skip, has that extensible framework. I think Balsamic is another platform that does that pretty well, that could potentially allow you to maybe even choose your target platform. I like React, I like Angular, that kind of stuff. Just as thoughts, to evolve the platform toward. You've got the core thing of a compiler that understands how to transpile to interesting SPA frameworks. And I think, as I see your demo, that's like a really portable part of it that you might push in different directions to see, who wanted to adopt it.
Absolutely. That's really good feedback, John. I appreciate it. Kind of, you triggered a thought that it could be added on to what you're saying is I had envisioned a third audience for this platform. So I think my mistake was almost being a little too futurist with it. And I think your idea is really concrete in how you would take something like this from today and grow it. I had envisioned a third role, which I was calling the app designer, which is the person who knows enough about design and enough about logic to create a whole app, right? So in the UI, all of these text-based things that you see here, where you're typing text or you're doing that, all that was going away in my next version of the editor. It was all going to be clicky, drabby, droppy type behaviors, so that you really didn't have to know about scopes or indexes. You could just say, I want a repeater function that you click this data source and then it just works. I wanted you to be able to do that whole thing in the editor so that there was this new kind of, and I think we see this in the industry already, where there's this third tier. You don't want to call them a developer because they don't really know much about CS, but they know enough to, it's like the Excel gurus would be a great example, but they know enough about design where they can actually mold a full app themselves. And that's sort of what I had in mind.
One thing I was thinking about is, talk about no code or low code, and I'm always struck by the idea that people outside of the programmers world always think that we're going to get a place where you don't have to write a line of code, everything just writes itself. And I look at this and I see, well, when you look behind the scenes, there's a fair bit of actual JavaScript there that's driving things that the user has to get to, because there's really no escaping it. Now, yes, you can put together building blocks which do exactly what you want, then yeah, you don't have to write any code. But as you see here, like, well, what if you have this little change? And as you pointed out, if you go off the book opening, now you're into, you got to write some JavaScript. Did you give any thought to how to make the JavaScript part of it any less, you have to be a programmer?
Yeah, so great question. There are already systems that have been built that completely replace programming and make it graphical, like from start to finish. If you think about like the core concepts of like a procedural language, you have like conditions, you have loops, right? You have data structures. You can represent all these things visually, right?
Still programming. I mean, I don't care what you're saying, like JavaScript syntax or lines and arrows and boxes. It's still writing a program.
That's why earlier when I was describing the third person I was designing this for, it was the designer and then a person who understands logic, right? So I sort of sneakily use the word logic to represent what you're describing, which is the strictness of the steps, right? That computers expect. But I mean, if you look at kids and the things they're learning today, I mean, it is very clear that it is a real part, becoming an integral part of our society to understand that kind of meticulous thinking. I mean, almost every successful field apart from say like sales and marketing would be is math oriented. And we all know the language of math is very strict.
I think Pete actually raised a really interesting point of being able to like go back and forth there a little bit. Like, as I was saying, the idea of like being able to use your compiler to take, the UI concept and generate a web application from it. He pointed out being able to go in the other direction. I think if that were an option in this toolkit of being able to effectively look at your common Angular application or a pre-built React application and translate it back into something that is now in designer mode, that's an interesting loop to be able to close, because you could have really intelligent components then that aren't necessarily things that had to be thought up at the Bliss UI workshop, that could come from the wild, that could then be sucked into a graphical designer that really could do, those components could be as smart as we wanted them to be. They could wire up to arbitrary APIs and that kind of stuff. I'm looking for that middle ground there, buddy, that allows us to leverage the intelligence of developers when we need that point, and doesn't leave them thinking, oh, step one, rewrite all this, and if part of it is like a back and forth or a fluid conversation between carefully developed artifacts and carefully designed experiences, then that's getting kind of the best of both things there. And you don't need that mythical kind of app designer who can do all of those things, because they're pretty rare. And yes, society might be tending toward more analytic capabilities, but I still think that the audience that you're pitching toward right now is that designer, but it doesn't necessarily produce the end result that a programmer would be willing to pick up, and it's not quite as friendly as the designer needs in order to do. They're willing to do pretty hard things. If you look at like Sketch or Omnigraphic, or Illustrator, those UIs are hard to use. They take a lot of training and getting good at them, especially getting good at them to the point where you're not copy and pasting the world, where you can execute a site-wide change with a few subtle kind of things. Those are still very hard things to do. So there's a lot of room for improvement, in my mind, in the tooling that the designers are using, but they're willing to tackle pretty hard problems with those UIs. They just need to be pitched in full UI mode. When I resize something, I don't want to be telling you height and width. I want to, just drag the thing. So it does have to have that heuristic to be attractive to a designer. But I think, a really great platform would be able to go back and forth pretty easily. I guess was my overall point.
And I think the platform. So I completely agree with you, and I don't see any technical reason why you couldn't get 80% there, right? I mean, maybe if they make some programming mistakes or do wire up things in a weird way, the system might have trouble, actually importing it back into the system. But I think that's completely possible. This was like step one of a vision to get the conversation started in the industry. This was before a lot of these products existed or were popular. I think they were being built right as I was building it, but this was just a solo job. It was just one man show. I built all of it. And so, yeah, if I had a team of Nebo people, correcting my errors and making it better, yeah, you could totally do that, 100%.
And I think you're suggesting, John, even maybe a step further than I was hinting at. I think that idea of truly reverse engineering back into a structured designer
That's a
is pretty hard.
Yes.
I was thinking more that it generates code that then has clear extension points that are beyond just the extension points in the designer, where you can kind of extend the app, and then when it wants to regenerate, it knows how not to step over those extension points.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's
So let me just challenge the idea
Yeah.
that the reverse
It's
engineer
hard.
is insurmountably hard, maybe. I think if you're starting from known frameworks, if you're talking about a React starting point or an Angular starting point, there are things that you would be able to understand out of those frameworks, kind of out of the box. You know what an Angular component is.
Yeah, but different people code those so differently within the same framework that It's like you'd have to, I mean, I've seen React apps that are like, are you really, yes, technically they're both in the React ecosystem, but they just work so differently that any kind of assumptions about how people are going to do things may be.
Fair enough, but, and maybe I'll refine my thought to suggest that, you know, it wouldn't have to be 100% successful on every application that came across in the wild to have a lot of use. In other words, if it really, to have a lot of use, you really need to be able to support a community-based library as much as anything else, right? So as long as, if you were to publish standards, or at least bootstrap, you know, vanilla components that could then be, you know, reverse engineered, there'd be a lot of use in that as well. So maybe not every Angular application that you find in the wild would successfully go from code to design, but you know, if you implemented the right interfaces and, you know, had a few other standards going on, like you've got to use particular NGRX stores or something like that, then I think it still has a, you know, it has limitations to what it can do, obviously, at that point, but potentially has a fair amount of value in extending the platform from a pure design, publish, done to a more of a round trip kind of thing.
You could even argue that the first step would be to create one where you started in a platform like this, you exported, you did stuff, you pulled it back in, right? As your first step. And instead of saying, because then you could do all kinds of decorations with the code you generated that a developer wouldn't care about, but would be important for the round trip process to care about.
I might be getting back to what Pete was suggesting, was adding extension points that are losslessly, you could bring them back and not hurt them. You know, like.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that this particular platform is quite flexible. So all these ideas fit quite naturally into it. You know, you could build compiler, you could build imports, you know, it's all, because it just uses the simple building blocks. Yeah, this is all quite possible. Intriguing ideas for sure.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you very much, buddy. Appreciate you bringing the topic up.
So we're all going to build this platform next week. Thanks, guys, for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Homework.